We don't have any homework due today, so you have homework. Okay, I'll take that now, sure. But there's no memory quiz today, so that's pretty good. We are getting into a new unit now. So to quick review where we've come so far in the course, we started off with just kind of the basics of what apologetics is. We talked about how there are people who are critical of the Christian faith from the outside, and they're going to ask you tough questions, questions that they've had their whole lives. And if you aren't prepared to answer those questions, not only will you be a less effective witness to them, but they might even shake your own faith as well. There have been countless Christians in America who were brought up in good church families and homes, and then they go off to college, and at the same time that all of your family and church and everything that ever supported you is left behind, you get thrust into this new environment where you are belittled and looked down upon for your Christian faith because it's stupid. And they bring all of these intellectual challenges against you that you've never heard before because nobody asked those kinds of questions in rural Minnesota. And so my job is to ask those questions with you guys now so that we can formulate good answers to them, and you don't have to kind of shrug your shoulders and blush when people ask you if science has disproved Jesus or something like that. And then, since science is always where people go first, we spent a long time talking about the scientific evidence for a recent creation of the world according to the account of the Bible, as well as the flood, which was a global event, so you would expect global evidence, and wouldn't you know it, you find it if you understand it the right way. You can spin a false story that fits all of the current evidence, but is very different than reality. And that's what those who cling to Darwinian evolution have done. But the evidence definitely does not disprove the Bible, and it very strongly favors the biblical accounts. Then we looked at the Bible itself. Then, once we finished the science of creationism and all that, we looked at the idea that the Bible itself is a reliable book. So we kind of started philosophically with a very general proof that there is a God, and some basic things that we can understand about him, like that he's good, that he's righteous, that he is powerful, that he's wise. And we determined that if such a God were to exist, which we have demonstrated that he does, then we should look for a way for him to reveal himself to us so that we can learn more about him. So we're already on the lookout for something like the Bible. And then we talked about all of the textual evidence that we have, manuscript evidence that the Bible really is a special and important book. And even though you can't prove scientifically something that is outside of nature, like a supernatural God, you can certainly find evidence that kind of suggestively is like, hey, this book, there's something special about it. This is no ordinary book. And so with all of that laid as a foundation, we're now going to tackle one of the most central questions to the Christian faith, a series of central questions about the Christian faith, namely about Jesus, who is the center of the Christian faith. Maybe I could have worded that better if I had started from the beginning the right way. But Jesus is the center of our faith. People ask a lot of questions about Jesus. And now that we are equipped to use the Bible in a winsome way, even against somebody who doesn't believe it or wasn't raised to believe it, we can better understand who Jesus is. And so this unit of the course, which goes from lesson 6 to I don't even know how far it goes. Lesson 6 to lesson 9. Is that all? 3 lessons? 4 lessons. 6, 7, 8, 9. Those 4 lessons, hi Ivy, welcome, are going to focus on specifically on the person and work of Jesus himself and the evidence about that. The same rules still apply. All I don't want to say all science is good science, because some of it is some things people publish that ought not be published because it's not actually good. But basically, we're going to be looking at more than just because the Bible tells me so. We're going to be looking at some evidence from outside of the Bible, as well as examining a little more critically evidence inside the Bible that points us to the reality of Jesus and what he did. So this first one is lesson 6. It's on page 25 in your book. So you can go ahead and turn there to page 25 if you got your workbook with you. Isaac, have you got yours? Okay, cool. Ivy, you're sharing today, it looks like. Is it a sharing day? Oh, I'm glad you're here. And the question is, did Jesus even exist? So this one, it's rare to find a critic who doesn't acknowledge that Jesus existed. I mean, it's crazy to think that arguably the single most powerful force that has shaped the Western world in the last 2,000 years is based on a person who never even existed, right? And you don't have to be a Christian to acknowledge that Jesus was a real person. And we'll get to more of the Christian claims, the religious claims in future chapters. But we do have to deal with the fact that there are people who think that Jesus didn't even exist. So page 25 in your book there. And yeah, so we're going to look at why that's important and what we can. Let's just get into this. In his letter to young Timothy, Paul calls the mediator between God and people the man Christ Jesus. By faith, we know Jesus as our Lord and Savior. However, in this lesson, we will explore evidence for the existence of Jesus outside of the Scriptures. Why might you want to prove the existence of Jesus? Yeah, right.
Sure, our faith is real.
To what that our faith is real?
To show that our faith is real.
To show that our faith is real. Very good. Yeah. So, yeah, if you can't even prove, if your faith is based on history, which ours is, I should go into that a little bit. So there are a lot of religions in the world that don't actually care about history. Not that they don't care, but their whole system is just built around what you do and how you relate to God or whatever the divinity is, the big thing in that religion. Christianity is not totally unique. There are other religions that base themselves in history, but history is a very important part of Christianity. The fact that our God is real and that he is at work in this world and that he has recorded and transmitted to us by way of the Bible the things that he has done in this world, those things matter. And nowhere does it matter more, perhaps, than the fact that Jesus was a real person. Jesus is not just a figment of our imagination that we look to for inspiration to live a better life, which is what some people think Jesus is to Christians. But Jesus is a real human being who lived in this world at a specific time and place and did some specific things that actually matter. And to be able to prove the existence of Jesus then is critical, whereas a lot of people, and even some so-called Christians, would not think that that's a big deal. So there are possible sources for the existence of, for historic evidence for the existence of Jesus. There are classical Greek or Roman writings and testimonies, so we'll be looking at a couple of those. Actually, I think in this lesson we only look at one, but we'll look at another one later. So basically, yeah, people who are outside of the Jewish Christian tradition who write about Jesus, because he was, after all, an important cultural force, even in the first century. There are Jewish scriptures and other writings. So we looked extensively at we didn't look extensively at Jewish prophecies about Jesus. We will in this unit. We'll be looking at how Jesus fulfills the Jewish scriptures. But then also there are Jewish people who lived at the time of Jesus who wrote about him who were not Christian. We're going to look at one named Flavius Josephus, or just Josephus in a moment. And then we have the scriptures writing, the Christian scriptures writings and testimonies. Let's make a chart here and look at some of the pros and cons. How do I want to do this here? We'll do pros and cons. So pros are good things and cons are bad things. And we're looking at the pros and cons of, let's see here, of Christian sources versus non-Christian sources. So for all of of the historical evidence we're going to be looking at, I think it's pretty obvious it will fall into one of those two camps. Either the author is a Christian or the author is not a Christian. So what are some of the pros of listening to Christian sources talk about Jesus? Yeah?
You can get a better understanding.
Better understanding, yeah, they get him, right? Have you guys seen those commercials for some vague Christian movement called He Gets Us? I think they advertised in the Super Bowl last year. He Gets Us. It's kind of cheesy. I'm not against it, but it's a little. Anyway, He Gets Us. But when we're studying sources who talk about Jesus, the Christian sources get him. They might not get him perfectly, because, he is an infinite God, and we are mere human beings. But you got to admit, the Christian sources understand Jesus. There were terrible rumors about early Christians outside of the church that said they engaged in secret cannibal ceremonies because the early church had such a high view of the sacrament of the altar, where the real presence of Jesus comes to us in his body and blood. They had such a high view of the holiness of that sacrament that they would dismiss anybody present in a worship service who was not a confirmed communicant member of that church, even if they were still learning the faith and very much wanted to learn and believe it. They were dismissed from the room and the doors closed during the sacrament of the altar. Even today, we have a sharp division in our liturgy between the Word, the service of the Word, and the service of the sacrament. You can usually mark the transition, because that's when I give my speech that I really need to just write down, where I talk about why certain people should not partake of the sacrament with us. That is the modern doctrine of closed communion. The ancient doctrine of closed communion, they literally kicked you out and closed the door. And that led a lot of non-Christians to think that the Christians were eating human body and blood. Because after all, that is exactly what they said they were doing. We're going to leave you out now while we eat our Savior's body and drink his blood. That sounds easily misunderstood. So a non-Christian source, and there are a lot of them, would accuse Christians of cannibalism, whereas a Christian source would have a better understanding of what's really happening. And that's just one example of the Christian religion, but it also applies to Jesus himself, who is the singular focus of this lesson. Can you think of any other pros that come from learning about Jesus from Christian sources? It's all right if you can't. Can you think of any cons? What are some downsides to maybe not learning about Jesus from Christian sources, but trying to come up with evidence for Jesus from Christian sources? Why would you maybe not want to use Christian sources? Ivy?
Because what they say could be wrong or misunderstood easily.
Okay. I'm gonna put biased. I think that's the word you're looking for there. Misunderstood. What do you mean by misunderstood? No? Alright, so you're probably just gonna be fine with biased? Okay, yeah.
Interpret it wrong.
What's that?
They interpret it wrong.
Okay, subject to misinterpretation. I can see that because Jesus, as we mentioned, is infinite and complicated. I can't talk and spell at the same time, sorry. Misinterpretation, and I don't want to look like an idiot and spell things wrong on the board, So Jesus is big and mysterious, and some of the things that his followers say about him are easily misunderstood, like eating his body and drinking his blood. Subject to that. The biggest problem, and I assume bias is spelled with 2 S's. I'm looking at you. You're the only one who's scared of me. You think it's only one? Yeah, I think you might be right. It looks wrong, but maybe that's just because it's a naughty word up there. So okay, but it's not based. It's not based or even blazed. In any case, the biggest problem with using Christian sources is that anybody that you're trying to convince of the existence of Jesus is obviously not a Christian, and he's just going to write it off and be like, oh, that's all bias, that's all religious crap. You can't, if Jesus is just some cult leader, or if Jesus is just some made-up fantasy, then of course the people who follow him are going to say that he's real. That's not evidence that he's real. That's just evidence that there was a cult that called him God or whatever. So biased and subject to misinterpretation. Now, what are some pros of using a non-Christian source? Yeah?
Like, they can give you an alibi, like, say they wrote about Jesus and they weren't Christian.
What do you mean by an alibi?
Like, if they saw Jesus and they wrote about it and they weren't Christian,
Mm-hmm.
that's like another source that is saying Jesus is real.
Okay. The more the merrier, I guess is the what I'm getting there, right? The more sources, the better off we are. I think you're on track to something bigger, though. What else are some pros of using non-Christian sources? There's not a word for what I want to describe to you, but I'm going to try to describe it anyway. I'm going to use a whole other board, right? So there is something, I'm going to use red for this. There is something called a hostile source. A hostile source, do you know what the word hostile means there? It means angry or mean or generally unfriendly. A hostile source is somebody who reports facts, claims to reports facts, doesn't like them, but doesn't like their subject. So, for example, Flavius Josephus did not like Christians. He thought they were bad, and yet he wrote about Jesus. And when a hostile source says something that agrees with the friendly source, that's the opposite of hostile. So if Christian sources are friendly and non-Christian sources are hostile, if the two sources agree, then it's almost certainly true, right? Because a hostile source would like to lie. In fact, I'll put this one up here. Likely to lie, right? Like, Christians are cannibals kind of thing. But one really good thing about hostile sources is that must admit obvious truths. So, Christians are cannibals, non-Christians are going to say true, and Christians are going to say false. Jesus existed, the non-Christian sources say true, and the Christian sources say true. So, the only reason a non-Christian source would say that Jesus exists is because it is obvious to everyone who would have read his writing that Jesus existed. Of course Jesus existed. You'd be a fool to say that he didn't exist. And so when a hostile source says something that agrees with a friendly source, it's almost certainly true. And so you can wade through a mountain of lies in a non-Christian source, but when you find a kernel of truth, that is extremely strong evidence, because the author has every motivation to lie. Because he doesn't like the Christians, and they were not very popular outside of the church in the Roman Empire. Doesn't like the Christians, wants to lie about them, lies a lot, but then says something that's actually true because he has no choice. If he doesn't admit the obvious truths, then nobody's going to take him seriously. Does that make sense? So, I can't think of a good example, like a modern example, but I'm just going to put here hostile sources must try to appear credible. That's a good way to put it. Credible. So you have to admit what everybody in the audience knows to be true. And everybody in Josephus' audience is very different than everybody in our audience. People nowadays can very easily question whether Jesus existed. It's 2,000 years ago. He's a larger than life person. There's no way he could have existed. But if a hostile source from Jesus' own era says that he existed, it must be because everybody knew it and it was obvious. So the admission from a hostile source itself becomes evidence that the truth is actually true. What are some cons of using non-Christian sources? We've kind of touched on that already. Yeah?
They can make up stories.
Yeah, lots of lies. Lies. Not everything they say is true. So we don't cite Flavius Josephus as if he were the inspired word of God. We use him as a hostile source. But hostile sources are still useful. Even though he was no friend to Christians, he's actually one of the greatest friends to Christians as a historian. And he wrote volumes. Oh my gosh, he wrote so much. Not all about Jesus. He wrote his collected works are called Antiquities of the Jews. And his job that he took upon himself was to record the history of the Jewish people in the early days of the Roman Empire. Not the early days of Christianity. He didn't care about Christianity. He lived when he lived. He wanted to write down the history of the Jewish people, so he did. But even in first century Rome, you can't write a history of the Jews and not mention Jesus because of the way he revolutionized the Jewish people. Okay, questions on that? Very good. Hostile sources are just a fascinating thing. I'm trying to think, there's got to be some courtroom kind of thing. I know there's a movie called My Cousin Vinny, where it's from like the 80s, but it's these two kids get accused of committing a murder that they didn't commit. And the one kid is like, my cousin Vinny's a lawyer, because they don't have money. And my cousin Vinny's a lawyer, he might come and defend us. And so the whole movie's about that. And in the end, Vinny wins the case by calling in somebody who clearly hates him. And the judge is like, let the record show that this is a hostile witness. And Vinny asks her question. She's still sworn to tell the truth, but she's not going to cooperate with the guy who's asking her questions. Which usually, if you call in a witness, it's like a friend who's going to say nice things on your behalf. So this was a hostile witness who was ready to say terrible things, and then she wound up proving what needed to be proved. Because anyway, it was a pretty good movie. Let's look at getting back on topic here. Let's look at some classical and Jewish authors here. This is on page 26 in your workbooks. The first one we're going to look at is a guy named Tacitus, and usually we refer to authors just by their last name. So Caius Cornelius Tacitus is the subject here. Who wants to read that paragraph under classical? Ivy, go for it.
Caius Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman senator, orator, and historian. His
Annals, yes, not the other word. Go ahead.
written about 116 to 17. Tacitus recorded how Nero shifted the blame for the burning of Rome to the
Christians. Yep.
Founder, Christus, Latin for Christ, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Terrorists.
Very good. So Christians, there's going to be some misinformation. I guess I'll throw that in there too, because he wasn't trying to misspell the word Christian. But obviously, if he's writing about Christians whose leader Christus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, I mean, that's like literally in the Apostles' Creed. So it's the same Jesus. And so we'll put Josephus here, I'll put him in black, as a hostile source. And he says, this isn't Josephus. This is, what's this guy's? Tacitus, that's right. Tacitus. And so he wrote, let's see here, that Nero blamed Christians. I wrote Chestians. Hold on. Christians in quotes there, because that's actually what he said, the burning of Rome, right? So that was the thing. Nero was the emperor of Rome, I think around 50 or 60 AD, somewhere in there. He was the one who martyred Peter and Paul. If you ever wonder how Jesus' apostles died, there are traditional records of the death of all of them except for John, who alone lived to die of old age. The others were killed for their faith. And Nero was personally responsible for the death of Peter and Paul, who were basically the two heaviest hitters of the early church outside of Jesus himself. And the way that he got them was that he called for an empire-wide persecution of Christians because it was their fault that Rome burned. During Emperor Nero's rule, there was a big fire in Rome, and it spread very quickly, as fires in large wooden cities often do. And a lot of people died, and a lot of valuable things were destroyed. And everybody wanted to blame somebody. Most people would blame the leader, but the leader said, it wasn't me, it was the Christians. And these Christians followed, I'm just going to put CHR in quotes, followed Christ, who, I'll make this a separate bullet point, was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Crucified under Pilate. And this is under Tiberius Caesar, which I don't think Tiberius Caesar is ever mentioned in the New Testament, but time-wise it fits. The emperor of Rome was always called Caesar. Julius Caesar was the first, and he did such a great job that everybody who followed him took on his name as a title. So there was Julius Caesar, and then there was Caesar Augustus, who was the Caesar over the Christmas story. And then there were, Nero was actually called like Nero Caesar or something like that. And sometime between Augustus and Nero, there was Tiberius Caesar. And Tacitus wrote, what is that, in 116? We'll put 116. It's always important to note when things were written, right? If Tacitus wrote in 500 AD, then he obviously, is just writing a research paper based on what others have written. But if he's a historian writing at this time, that means that he's living through this, this period. He wouldn't have known Jesus personally, but he still, he might have known some of Jesus' apostles. And he indeed did write about the Christians. And then, aside from Tacitus, we're looking at Josephus here. Who wants to read about Josephus? Go ahead, Riker.
Josephus was a first-century Jewish priest who lived in Rome under the
patronage
of three
successive. That means one after the other.
Successive Roman emperors. Josephus was a traitor by fellow Jews for his involvement with the Roman leaders. Josephus authored two great books, the Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, both written in Greek for an educated audience. Some versions of the Jewish War mention Jesus, but scholars suspected these references were added by others.
Very good. So Josephus is a little bit difficult. Really, all of these authors are a little bit difficult because a lot of times it seems that things have been added to them, and Josephus was Josephus was popular enough that that people would have tried to influence what he wrote and published and things like that. And so I'm going to have you guys read for your homework a section of Josephus, a very small section, like a paragraph. And it's going to be obvious that it's going to, I don't want to say obvious because it might not be true, but it's going to seem very evident that Josephus is being made to say things that he probably didn't believe. Namely that he calls Jesus the Christ, but then elsewhere says that he himself is not a Christian. Elsewhere he says that Christians are terrible people. And he's definitely a hostile source. But not everything that he says about Jesus is so obviously redacted. And even critics admit that some of what he says about Jesus appears to be original. That's the word I'm looking for there. And that is in Jewish Antiquities. Isaac, you want to read that one for us? It's the second paragraph under the word Jewish. Second, yeah, right there.
Here?
Yeah.
Jewish
Antiquities.
You must talk about the history of James, the leader of the church, and James also
In Jerusalem. He specifically identifies
James as the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ.
this reference, yeah, makes sense.
Only if Jesus was a real person.
Very good. So yeah, Josephus relates the execution of James. Actually, James wasn't one of the apostles, but he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And so it would be very relevant then to Josephus to note that James was executed. But very interesting that he claims that James is the brother of Jesus. So you can't be the brother of somebody who doesn't exist. So this is one place where Josephus is clearly acknowledging that Jesus actually existed and that he's called Christ. Now that's not Josephus saying he is the Christ. He's just saying that Jesus was called Christ, which any honest historian would have had to do in those days. I guess I'll read the last paragraph there. A longer reference in Jewish Antiquities is known as the Testimonium Flavianum. This passage talks about the surprising deeds performed by Jesus and how he won over many Jews and Greeks with his teaching. Josephus remarks that Jesus' followers were still around to that day. Some experts question whether the passages referring to Jesus as the Messiah and the fulfillment of prophecy are all Josephus' writing. Even without these specific phrases, though, there is still sufficient evidence for Jesus' existence as a man. Right? Because the question we're dealing with right now is not, is Jesus the Christ? It's simply, did Jesus even exist? And so hostile sources must begrudgingly admit that, as much as they hate him and his followers and troublemakers or whatever, he did exist. He was a real person. And let's see here. I wrote a note on the value of a hostile source. Let me make sure I got it all. The few points on which hostile sources agree with us are by definition not under dispute, right? If both sides agree to something, then they're not arguing about it. Put another way, if there was any chance that Jesus simply didn't exist, his enemies would have said so. Instead, they take it as given. That's a good way to put it. So if you are angry at somebody and you want to say bad things against them, and you know some bad things against them, you're going to say those bad things. And the fact that they don't say, by the way, your stupid Jesus doesn't even exist, the fact that they don't say that is basically a tacit admission that he did exist. So let's sum up the evidence here, and then we have a little exercise I want to do with the rest of our time together. So review the evidence presented by the classical and Jewish witnesses and summarize below. So what are some of the evidences that, I suppose I wrote them down over there, huh? Well, I guess that's pretty much what that is from here. There is more than just these two little snippets. But, this book is written at like an 8th grade level, so you're not going to get a whole college level research paper on classical testimonies about Jesus. But be aware that they're out there, and here's a couple of good examples. Is kind of what our book is going for here. The exercise on the next page is for homework, actually. So we're going to skip right up to page 28. And this one is a little more personal. It's called Make a Plan, right? So, of course, the heart and soul of apologetics is not just for your own benefit, but also so that you can talk to other people who have questions about the Christian faith. And so this is an exercise to that end. Consider your friends or family who doubt the reality of Jesus. Without naming names, do you guys know anybody that doubts whether Jesus even existed? It can be easier to do this exercise if you have someone in mind. You don't have to say who they are, but I'd like to know if you even know anybody who doubts the existence of Jesus. You got a head shake from Isaac? Okay. Riker and Ivy are very quietly naming names. Okay, you're not sure. You might, right? Well, if you even have someone in mind that you might be wrong about, it's still useful to have a face that you can kind of play mock conversations with as we talk about this. So what we're going to do, we're going to try to write a plan for how you could share with somebody who doubts the existence of Jesus some of the information that you learned in this lesson. Remember that a gentle response works better than an attack on another person's unbelief. Let me tell you right now, the state of social media is miserable, because that seems to be the only place where people dare to talk about matters of religion and faith. You don't see a lot of ordinary people talking about Jesus with their friends and family. But you do see somebody share a religious post on Facebook, and then somebody else give you a laundry list of reasons why this is wrong and stupid, and you are stupid for sharing it, and then the back and forth goes, and at the end of the day, the argument kind of peters out with both people feeling angry at each other, and nobody really being convinced one way or the other. We want to avoid that. So I find that a plan like this works best if you actually break it down into steps. What would be the first thing you want to do to talk to somebody about evidence for Jesus? You need to start the conversation. So step one is going to be initiate, which is just a fancy word for get it started. And the reason why I'm making this a whole step is because it's hard to talk to somebody about Jesus. You don't just walk up to like somebody on the street corner and be like, hey, yeah, I'd like to talk to you about Jesus. You know, I think even the Pope would be like, I'd like you not to, weirdo. You know, so you don't want to just do that. So what are some ways that you can initiate a discussion about Jesus? Anything.
Ask what their religion is.
Okay. So ask what they believe. That's good. I like that because it begins with a focus on the other. That is a strategy that I want to emphasize so much that I'm going to write it over here. Focus on them. On them. People love to talk about their opinions. People love to share what they really think about what's wrong with the world and stuff like that. And a lot of times it's easy as Christians to feel personally attacked when people say that it's those darn Christians that are the problem. But if you can suppress the instinct to defend yourself and just continue to ask more, they will say more, and you will get to understand them better, and you'll get a better feel for where they need to be corrected. You know. Whereas if you just jump in defensively, you are denying yourself a lot of information. So a great way to initiate is to ask what they believe, because then they'll just be like, oh, well, all right, here's what I believe. And it's good to find somebody who cares. What are some other ways you can initiate a discussion? This isn't the only option. You could wait for an opportunity. Right, so this one is harder because the opportunity might never come. Opportunity. The opportunity might never come. So if it's like, a dear friend or something, the waiting strategy might not be best. But if you happen to overhear somebody being like, Jesus never existed, right? that would be an opportunity to be like, why do you think that? Which then is still a question, asking what they believe. But you're waiting for them to initiate. They're the one who said the thing that you want to talk about. You are just, following their lead kind of thing. Very good. Step 2 is listen. Listen to them. It is very, very tempting, as I've already mentioned, to counter, to argue, to fight what they're saying, especially when what they're saying is wrong and offensive personally to the very core of your identity. But the fact of the matter is, the more they talk, the better you know them. And that's really what's important. You are not going to change the world with some kind of rousing speech that just shuts down the other side completely. I've been getting a lot of memes on Facebook lately. It's something like, explain this, atheists, or something like that, and it's some silly thing that looks supernatural. There is no explain this, atheists, that is actually going to shut down the entire movement of atheism. It just doesn't exist. So when you are addressing a person, it's very easy, especially if you don't listen, to just paint them with a broad brush. Oh yeah, she likes abortion, so she must be one of those baby killers. I bet she wants to dye her hair purple and date girls too. Something like that. And you just kind of lump her in, oh yeah, she's one of them. And you fill in the blanks. You're like, this is obviously who you are, and I'm telling you that. But that's not true. People aren't like that. Real people aren't. Some people can be a little bit eccentric in one way or another, but every person is an individual. And as an individual, you need to listen to what they say so that you can understand where they're coming from. Don't assume. Don't assume. So to assume means to do what I just described, where you hear one or two viewpoints that the person holds, and automatically you think a whole bunch of other things because they fall into a camp. You give them a label, right? Oh, they're a liberal. I know about the liberals. I know what they believe, but you don't know what this one believes unless you assume, and assuming is bad. Don't assume. Instead, you might want to do number 3, which is ask for more details. Or more. Notice this is almost like a subset of number 2, listen. But instead, what you're doing now is trying to give them something more to say. So this is the kind of thing where a person would be like, okay, you initiate the conversation, what do you believe about Jesus? I say, well, he obviously didn't exist. And you might your temptation is going to be like, whoa there, slow down, who says he didn't exist? But instead, what you can just say is, why do you think that? Leave it very open-ended. Give them a chance to talk about themselves. Well, I think that because people think that he was God, and obviously he wasn't God because God isn't real. And so now you've just learned that this person is an atheist, where they might have been like an agnostic or a Hindu or something like that. But now, and that's just because they talked and you listened. And so then you could maybe go on and be like, well, you say that God isn't real. Do you believe anything about any kind of supernatural stuff? And then you can get them talking about that. And, if they start to stray too far, bring it back to Jesus somehow. Hey, have you heard about Josephus? And that's actually what I wrote for number 4. I wanted to put a subtitle in number 3, though, and I forget what it is. Let me see, I'll just put specific beliefs. Right? This person is not a caricature of a movement. They are a human being, and they believe certain things, and they have reasons for that. Number 4 then is what I'm going to call the rebuttal, although that sounds more aggressive than it needs to. A rebuttal would be like in that mock conversation I had, if they say, well, obviously Jesus didn't exist because, his followers just made him up so that they could have a God-man to worship, then you could say, what about Josephus? Are you familiar with what Josephus wrote? And they would probably, depending on how old you are when you have this conversation, if they're an 8th grader in Henning, they're probably going to say, who the crap is Josephus? If they're in college, they might be like, oh, the name rings a bell or something, but I don't know how many people outside of Christianity know that Josephus wrote about Jesus. But again, stick with questions. Like, what about, I can't write sideways. I can't write it all. What about yada, yada, yada? Or have you heard yada, yada, yada? Have you heard about what Tacitus said, the historian Tacitus? Eventually, sooner or later, a conversation like this has to come to an end. You can see the whole board, right, Ivy? Okay. I'm just checking the geometry. Eventually, the conversation has to come to an end, and so 5 is just what happens next. What can you do for a person after the conversation is over? Yeah? Thank him. Yeah, very good. I'm running out. I'm gonna move next up here. This is too low. There's some good stuff we're gonna put under this one, so I'm gonna put 5 up here. Next. So yeah, courtesy goes a long way. Like I said, with these Facebook conversations, usually you just end up with both parties being angry or summoning help so that even more people can be angry and stuff like that. So yeah, saying thank you. I'm really glad we had this conversation. That's good stuff. We can pray for them. This is something that you can do when you're not talking with them. I guess if you're good at mental multitasking, you can do it while you're talking with them, but you generally want to be focused on them when you're talking with them, and then pray for them outside, because who is it ultimately that gives faith? It's not you, it's not me, it's not even the awesome powers of science and reason, but it's the Holy Spirit. And when you pray for somebody, that is inviting the Holy Spirit to do His work. And it helps you not to have the attitude of like a Christian salesman, right? You're not trying to sell them on Jesus. You don't get a commission if they come to faith. You are doing this purely out of love for them and out of love for Christ and His kingdom and a desire to see it grow. So you pray for them because you are not ultimately the one who makes Christ's kingdom grow. Jesus will survive just fine without your input, but He has given you the honor of being able to lead somebody to Himself. What if they ask a question that you don't know the answer to? Can I get back to you on that? Is something you can say? Can I get back to you about? Come on, it's not an O or a U. About. Let's put question marks there. So yeah, a lot of times it's easy to view this kind of conversation as a contest. Who's smarter? Who knows more? And you might feel like you might be afraid to start that kind of conversation because you don't want to lose. You don't want to be the one who knows less. But the fact of the matter is that not everybody can be the smartest person in the world. And there's a very good chance that the smartest person in the world still doesn't believe in Jesus, because it's not about how smart you are. It's about the work of the Holy Spirit. So being humble enough to admit that you don't know the answer to a certain question, or that you would like to think about that a little more, or read about that a little more, is it's endearing in a way. You're not just coming at them like some know-it-all blowhard who they need to listen to, or else they're going to burn in hell. You are somebody who wants the truth to be known, and sometimes that might mean that you yourself need to be the one to learn something. So yeah, can I get back to you about what you said about whatever? I haven't had a conversation like this probably since I was in college. I've kind of been surrounded by church people since then, and they don't like to ask difficult questions. So after, I went to college at a very liberal school. It was University of Florida. It had 50,000 undergraduate students. It had its own police force and power plant. It was literally like its own self-contained city. And a lot of people there, were very hostile to Jesus. It was very much like the horror stories that you might hear about some people who, you go to a party school and the drinking's out of control and nobody loves Jesus and that sort of thing. And I survived there. I actually thrived there, I guess I should say. I was plugged into a church group, and that was very good for me and stuff like that. And then after that, I went to seminary, where I was surrounded by a bunch of people who wanted to become pastors. And then I went to a church in rural Minnesota, where I was surrounded by a bunch of Christians who wanted to impress their pastor. And I never really left that context. So yeah, these conversations are going to happen in your school. They're going to happen and your generation is, I think, a lot more likely to question Christianity than mine was. At least out here. My generation, I think, in Florida is probably a lot more like your generation here in rural Minnesota, because it takes some time for bad ideas to seep all the way into this part of the nation. But anyway, yeah. That's my strategy for you. I'm not going to say that it will win every argument, because you shouldn't think of them as arguments. They are opportunities to share your faith. And this apologetic stuff we're learning is just there to help you as a tool to lead a person to trust in Jesus, because that is the goal. Never lose sight of that. The goal is to show them Jesus. Any questions? All right, if you think of any, you're welcome to ask some. We are done a little bit early today. You guys want to play Stump the Pastor or something? We only got like 5 minutes. Any questions just burning a hole in your mind? Any tough questions that I could answer at a youth group, maybe? Because I'm running out of tough questions, and we're doing that series. Well, if you think of any, shoot me a text or something. Let me end up the homework. I'm sorry that I have been really bad about getting back graded papers. I'm still kind of recovering from, I'm still definitely recovering from my hard drive crashing at the end of the year last year, the end of 2024. If you guys have any, okay, let me back this up. Okay, I'll be honest, I've lost my grades. Okay, all of the grades that I recorded since the beginning of the school year are gone. And since I haven't made any new grades yet, because I haven't been grading papers, that's it. So here's what I want. I really, really, really would like some record of the homework assignments that I wrote for you, because I lost it all. So if you have graded papers, even if the grade was terrible, and you give it to me, I will give you extra credit. Okay? If you got a 10, did you just throw away all your papers?
Yeah.
Darn it. Oh, that's a shame. Well, if you dig them out of the trash can, I'll take them with coffee grounds. But I would really love, and okay, cool. And I've gotta ask your the last year's class if they have any. So I found by God's grace, I did email myself all of the answer keys for my newly created apologetics homework assignments in March of last year. And so I have those, but I don't have anything that I produced after March. So I'm gonna read out the last year's confirmands and see, because I made some pretty good assignments, I thought, some thought-provoking things for the stuff that comes after the Jesus unit. But don't worry, I've got plenty of homework for you for the Jesus unit. So part of this assignment is going to be drawing lines. You guys still do that, right? Like in school, where you have to match a statement with its answer or something like that? Okay, because I have a lot of students get really confused with that assignment, and I don't understand why. You draw a line from the statement to the Bible verse that matches it. And then the other ones are just basic comprehension questions from a very small paragraph from Josephus. So you get to read that and answer that. All right, I hear the kids, so let's head outside and we'll say our closing prayer together. Thank you guys for coming.